Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled HEOR and RWE, Global Sourcing Strategies and Best Practices. My name is Andrew Jordan and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. And today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes with time for a question and answer session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars really work best when you are involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and your comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box. And we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel. That's on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using that chat panel. And at this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. And please note that this event will be recorded and made available to you for future streaming on xtalks.com. And at this point, I'd like to thank Scientist.com who helped develop the content for this presentation. Founded in 2007, Scientist.com is the world's leading and fastest growing marketplace for outsourced scientific services and products. The marketplace significantly simplifies research sourcing by saving time and money and providing easy access to innovative tools and technologies while maintaining full compliance with an organization's procurement policies. Of course, you can visit for more information at scientist.com. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Julie Carter is Category Director, RWE and HEOR at scientist.com, and she possesses an MPH with a focus on epidemiology and has extensive experience in research, management, consulting, and IT services. Prior to joining Scientist.com, she was an internal consultant driving RWE projects at Bayer, focusing on strategy, data implementation, new technology rollout, training, and change management. Your second speaker for today, Dr. Patty Peoples, is a health economist, pharmacist, and researcher with 30 years of experience in healthcare outcomes improvement. She is founder and CEO of healtheconomics.com and is principal researcher at HE Institute, a strategic consultancy devoted to value demonstration communication. And finally, Mary Beth Ritchie is the Director, Epidemiology, Medical Devices, and Real-World Evidence at RTIHS. In her role, Dr. Ritchie is responsible for the scientific, technical, and logistic aspects of projects, including non-interventional safety, effectiveness, and utilization studies, regulatory landscape analysis, and consultation on timing, design, and practical application of methods for real-world studies. And now, it's with my pleasure to hand the presentation and the microphone over to your first speaker for today, and that's Julie Carter. Julie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our presentation and discussion today. My name is Julie Carter, and I'm Director of Real-World Evidence and HEOR at Scientist.com. Today, we're going to talk about what is real-world evidence and briefly explain what is the difference between HEOR. We will also go into the challenges and outsourcing within real-world evidence. We'll also provide current trends within real-world evidence and end with some best practices in creating a request for proposal for this area. Next slide, please. So what is real-world evidence? Real-world evidence is studies utilizing data obtained from real-world settings, and it's outside the tight controls of a clinical trial design. You may also hear the term real-world data, or RWD, and real-world data is the actual data that is used or generated within real-world evidence studies. So if you look at the visualization in front of you, this gives you a high-level overview of the product life cycle. You have your earlier clinical trial phases where the product is not out on the market yet, so each phase checks to ensure the product is safe and effective, and there is no need, and there is a need for this product to be launched into the market. Once you collect data from the clinical trials to gain regulatory approval, the product hits the market and is in the real world. One thing to note that while most of the real-world evidence activities currently does take place once the product hits the market, the product does hit the market with some questioning gaps. And this is primarily due to the design of the clinical trials being tightly controlled and a small sample of the population, which is not reflective of the real world. Hence, real-world evidence can be used to answer some of these gaps. Therefore, real-world evidence can be used in the earlier phases of the product life cycle to address these gaps earlier before a product hits the market. The application of real-world evidence in early phases of drug development may help to assist with things such as long clinical trial timelines, help with increasing in-patient enrollment in studies, and may help to bringing the product earlier into the market, which helps with cutting down costs and long clinical trial timelines. So the main message to remember when thinking about real-world evidence is that the data for these studies is not from traditional tightly controlled clinical trials, but data that reflects the behavior of a product in the real world, such as a clinical practice, and is not meant to replace clinical trials, but complement clinical trials in understanding the value story of a product. Next slide, please. There are many groups that utilize real-world evidence to answer questions and fill important gaps to highlight the value of a product. So the visualization you see in front of you is meant to show that there are different uses for real-world evidence depending on what group is utilizing real-world evidence. Each group has their own set of goals and methods to improve patient care by answering questions related to their function. They incorporate real-world evidence and the data from these types of studies into their strategy. So for example, HEOR, the end result for this group is to communicate the value of a product based on evidence to show that the product is cost effective. Market access is going to look to increase patient access to the product while also maintaining optimal pricing of the product. Regulatory is going to look to continually retain safe and effective products on the market. And lastly, epidemiology is going to look to demonstrate the benefits of the product, that the benefits are greater than the risks. These groups are not independent of each other. They do speak to each other, and some activities do overlap with each other. It's important to note not all of the activities for each group includes real-world evidence. There are some things that HEOR does that does not overlap with real-world evidence. It's also worth mentioning that real-world evidence is not limited to just these groups. There are multiple faces to real-world evidence, and the use of real-world evidence is going to depend on the function of the group. Next slide, please. And I'd like to go ahead and introduce Patty, who's going to speak regarding the challenges in this space.
Thank you so much, Julie. I am really honored to spend some time with my esteemed panelists, Julie and Mary Beth, and I'm particularly excited to spend some time with attendees. We've got some really exciting new research to share with you. Julie has set the stage for, if you'd go back to the previous slide, please. Julie set the stage for describing the differences between the various functions that contribute to the value story and the use of the real-world evidence research. And we're rapidly transitioning toward a world in healthcare that's based on patient choice that's supported by data on outcomes and value. And this information is derived from a data environment that is in rapid growth, but it's also achieving some greater acceptance and traction, if you will, with respect to data sources, cross-industry collaborations, data pools, and analytic approaches. And perhaps all of us here can envision in the next decade a place where we might have relevant data that actually has a better chance of influencing decisions in real time. But what does that mean for us right now? It means that there's an uptick in the demand for information, that more stakeholders are needing that data, and a greater expectation of the rapidity, if you will, with which we get those data. More research, faster, or faster science. Now, we've spent a lot of time in our industry talking about the barriers to the use of real-world evidence and data, including study design and implementation, uneven quality of the data sources, maybe limited access to those data or standardization issues, and in some cases, the very public support of real-world evidence. But we as an industry have not spent a lot of time looking at the operational challenges around getting the science accomplished. And that's what I want to spend some time with you today. Next slide, please. So just a few months ago, in October of 2018, healtheconomics.com and scientist.com teamed together to field the first ever benchmarking survey to better understand the HEOR and RWE sourcing and procurement challenges and opportunities. And we had more than 150 respondents involved in the HEOR RWE procurement process across the value chain. About a third were from biopharma, a little more than a third were from consulting or CROs, and about 8% represented payers and HTA organizations. The rest came from academic research groups and value communication firms. In terms of function, about 38% were directly involved with HEOR, 22% identified with market access, pricing and reimbursement, 15% were medical affairs and RWE, and about 5% were from the procurement operations side. The respondents were global, with a preponderance from North America of about 71%, 20% Europe, and 7% Asia. Next slide. So some of the key findings can be found in a white paper, which you as an attendee have the ability to access by going to the handouts tab, and you can download that white paper. And in this research, we found that about 71% of the researchers in biopharma and medical device outsource at least half to almost all of their work. So what are some of these challenges in outsourcing? This was the subject of the research. As most of you are engaged in this process in one way or another, you won't be surprised to find that a common frustration point was length of time from proposal to execution of the contract. Slow contracting time impedes getting the project into the field, delays those knowledge insight, slows down the market access, and hinders the decision making by the provider and the payer, and most importantly, affects the patient. And in fact, in the research, more than 1/2 of the respondents reported that the average time to contract was 2 to 3 months, and almost 10% had an average contract time of greater than 6 months. Now, from the supplier perspective, almost all, 8 of 10, reported some difficulty navigating that buyer procurement process, citing issues such as complex compliance requirements or lack of standardization of the buyer requirements. Some of these verbatims that we received might help elucidate this a little bit. As you see there, there's a senior data scientist from Big Pharma who stated that our procurement processes are not consistent between our global and local departments, and they're also not consistent with different types of organizations, meaning the procurement process is different if it's for procuring data versus if it is for a real-world evidence type of trial. On the supplier side, they noted that the procurement process differs between each buyer and it's impossible to streamline on their end. Now, necessarily our industry has moved toward preferred suppliers, certainly in an effort to standardize and control cost. And about 68% of the buyers often or always use preferred suppliers. One perspective was offered by an HEOR director at a pharma company who noted that having preferred suppliers, in this individual's opinion, actually served to limit competition, increase cost, and reduce quality. I'd be very interested from our attendees what you think of that. Next slide, please. In the survey, we examined the influence of sourcing and procurement departments and the key performance indicators that they use, and then looked at how those related to the HEOR and RWE function. About 2/3 of respondents on both the buyer and supplier side reported a dedicated department for sourcing and procurement, and 20% actually had a specialized procurement function directed toward HEOR and RWE. Now, key performance indicators are essential, as we all know, for project success. We all use them every day in our work. However, because of the unique nature of HEOR and RWE, the KPIs that are used may differ and need to be different than those used in clinical research or commercialization projects. And in fact, 70% of the respondents agreed that there are mismatches between the KPIs used by sourcing and procurement versus those that were important to HEOR and RWE. A medical device manager, senior global manager, noted that a key challenge is the rigidity and evaluation philosophies that are centered upon one dimension of the issue using the accounting or general financial metrics. A CRO manager said that the processes that are used for the HEOR and RWE projects differ from the parameters the outsourcing group utilizes in procuring services. So as an industry, I think there's a real opportunity for us to work together with these sourcing and procurement groups and between buyers and suppliers to align the KPIs with the HEOR RWE strategic objectives. And this may result in much better visibility of our departments to senior management, and particularly given the growing influence of sourcing and procurement to the C-suite, this is probably an essential call to action. Aligning these KPIs will also help us with some improved vendor selection and ultimately with more successful and quicker market access. The last issue I want to touch on here is that 59% of the buyers in the biopharma med device arena felt that it was challenging to compare potential suppliers for a project. The hurdles were related to identifying suppliers with a particular skill set or a particular data source so that making the right connection was possible. And conversely, the suppliers found it challenging to showcase their frequently changing set of services, data sources, and skill set. So the identified need was a more standardized approach to connecting buyers and suppliers, and a method that would enable comparing potential capabilities commensurate with the research need quickly, accurately, and completely. Next slide, please. So in summary, with this first ever benchmarking survey on HEOR and RWE sourcing and procurement, the hurdles identified related to long contracting time, standardization challenges, compliance requirements that were complex, the use of preferred suppliers and the silo mentality within the departments, KPIs, and with matching the buyer and suppliers for individual projects. The identified needs were related to these hurdles. In fact, most importantly, the need was for a standardized system that reduces those complex compliance requirements and enables us to achieve truncated contracting times while containing those costs. There was a need for some flexibility in selecting suppliers with the best skills and data sources for the project, and also a need for ensuring that HEOR and RWE has a voice where preferred suppliers are identified. Ensuring that variables used in procurement, whether they are KPIs or some other outcome assessment tool from a sourcing perspective, is accurately reflective of the HEOR RWE field needs. And lastly, the need for a new way to connect a diverse range of buyers and suppliers while differentiating the supplier skill sets. So in summary, as HEOR and RWE becomes more vital and complex and multidimensional, it's imperative for us as an industry to find solutions that address these outsourcing and procurement challenges so that we can speed up the delivery of the data and, most importantly, get that science into the field so that we can improve the patient outcomes more quickly. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Mary Beth now.
Thanks so much, Patty. My name is indeed Mary Beth Ritchie, and I work at RTI Health Solutions. On that next slide, tell you a little bit about us. We are a group of about 300 people who work across 8 different practice areas, almost all within the real-world evidence space. And we've been doing this for quite a while now. My expertise is in medical devices, but we do have others who work in oncology and other therapeutic areas as well. Our typical portfolio mirrors the medical device and drug industry these days. And so as we are working in the real-world evidence space, we've noticed 3 big trends that are happening. We've noticed a need for more real-world evidence. We've noticed that the experience and expertise of those who are needing this is changing a bit. And we've noticed some new thoughts around the data sources involved. And so on that next slide, the need for real-world evidence is indeed increasing. And this means that there is sometimes more funding being put into real-world evidence. But a lot of companies feel that if they're switching from clinical trials into this space, that they're going to have less money that they want to put into it. And so while there may be more funding, we do need to do more with it. And those that have the purse strings are thinking more about it. And so the higher ups at a company have more visibility into what's going on with RWE, real world evidence. And also other stakeholders, reimbursement agencies and regulators are also thinking more about this. So we all need to be strategic and really think through not just asking for a real world evidence study, but really what do we need in this space. On the next slide, when it comes to expertise and experience, we're noticing that more people are getting involved in real world evidence and that companies are doing this where they haven't done it in the past. And so because of that, there is less experience among some folks who are doing this. But we're also seeing that there are a number of groups that have been doing this for quite a while. And so there's a depth of methodology in research design and in analysis from multiple perspectives in this space as well. And so when you're working with a group that has less knowledge and a group that has more knowledge, it's really nice because everyone's bringing enthusiasm as well as their knowledge to the table. And so we can really think through the best methodologies for a reimbursement agency or for a regulator. And we can really pool together to have sufficient experience to cover knowledge gaps and really work cross-functionally very well. On the next slide, there are lots of new data sources available. In addition to insurance claims and electronic healthcare records, there's also wearables and other options for grabbing new clinical data. We also can still, as we have, go and get new data prospectively. And so with all of these different options, there's the temptation to think first about the data source itself. But we really do still need to come back to the research question. We want to go out and find that data source, and we want to be able to say, this is quality data, so we're going to use this data source all the time. But if we think first about the research question, we very quickly realize that quality is defined based upon the strategic research need. And so a good data source for one thing may not be appropriate for another. So we're very interested in all of the data that exists here. And so on the next slide, in 2017, we did a literature scan of everything that had been published that called itself real-world evidence. And we found that different groups thought that real-world evidence was what they did. So for those who are using existing data in the medical records and claims, they thought that real-world evidence was there. For those that are generating registries and pulling together new primary data, they thought that real-world evidence was there. And it absolutely and totally is both of those, as well as the literature. We also found that real-world evidence is existing across therapeutic areas, and that it is used often within all of those for different stakeholders. Next slide. So our approach is indeed to really think through what's going on and to be more strategic about it. We have found that when we work with folks who are first defining what their needs are, and then identifying what information is already in existence and where the gaps are, that then they know that the research questions they have for new studies are the best ones to be addressing. And that way, whether it's a retrospective data collection in order to gather what's already happened, or whether there's a very, very specific nuance that needs to be pulled into a prospective data collection, that decision can already be made up front, and the group will know that it fits very well into their strategy along the way. Also, if you have a strategy up front, then the messaging for regulators, for reimbursement agencies, for clinicians, and for patients can all be similar, and then your communication can be planned across the way as well. And as you're filling in these data gaps, it helps to then be able to update the strategy for the next round. On the next slide, we've noticed that the thing that people miss most is feasibility. And that is often because it does take some time and effort up front, but it is best to know walking into a full-blown study whether the data will address the question at hand, whether there are going to be enough people with the data sources that you've looked into, and whether data partners are all on board to do this study. It's also really helpful to be able to think through what the ethics requirements are going to be within the country where you're going to be doing the study. And if you're doing a prospective data collection, it's great to use the feasibility time to really help sites be interested and get engaged in the process as well, because timelines matter quite a bit for real-world evidence. And so on that next slide, there are different stages that need to happen with any real-world evidence study. And so as you're going through each of these stages and each of these steps, they do indeed take time. But when you plan ahead and you think through what's going on, then it is much easier to allot the time up front and to be able to discuss with your research partners how best to address each stage. So who should you engage for real-world evidence? On that next slide, we've noticed that having people who both have knowledge and experience leads to the best possible studies. That if you are working with those who have done it before and understand that there's an increased focus in this real-world evidence space, and know that the rules are changing, that those folks are well equipped to help to get to the best evidence. In addition, if you work with those who have a track record of being strategic and utilizing data that are fit for purpose, as well as the appropriate design and methodologies, then they are well positioned to be able to engage the reimbursement agencies, the regulators, and to be able to work well within a particular therapeutic area with you. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Julie.
Thank you, Mary Beth. So I will go ahead and end the presentation on what are some of the best practices that we should utilize when sending a request for proposal. So the visualization you see shows a standard request for proposal template that we use on our system at scientist.com. And clients use this template to submit requests to suppliers. You most likely have heard to provide a lot of detailed information as possible. However, the best practice is to provide the right information as much as possible. So what I want to do is run through key pieces of information that tend to be left out of the RFP that is essential to understanding a project. So I'll start with, at the top, the product and indication, which usually people don't forget this piece, but what about your product is unique and why does the product matter? This helps with telling the value story for the project proposal and completion. Don't assume the supplier will completely understand your product and the history, especially if this is a new supplier you're working with. And go ahead and provide evidence and literature to support the product history if you have that available. You also want to define acronyms and definitions because the person you send the RFP to may not be the expert in that area, but they can forward the RFP to the right person who can respond to the RFP. Moving on to the background, the number one information that is the most forgotten piece of information in the RFP is why we are doing this project. What is the problem you're trying to solve? What's your research question? What evidence and gap is missing that we're trying to fulfill? Sometimes we focus too much on the solutions rather than clearly defining why this project is needed. The supplier can also provide an alternative solution and really understand the request if they know why this project is needed and what necessary information is needed to fulfill the gap that you have. Moving on to the second most forgotten piece of information is who is the end user. The information that will be generated from the real-world evidence study, who will be reviewing that information? Is the information going to be provided to a regulatory agency, a provider, somebody else? This will help the supplier also design the best project proposal, keeping in mind the target audience and clearly address the objectives. Also for deliverables, all expectations clearly defined and not just the end products such as the protocol, study report, manuscripts, etc. This includes deliverables from the starting point, such as the strategy and design. How much of the work do you want the supplier to own, including identifying and accessing a data source? That's a question that happens a lot and increases the back and forthing that we see in the RFP process. The question of, do I need to own the data source or do I need to have access to the data source? So completely defining all expectations and milestones will help with running a more efficient RFP process. Lastly, what are the expected timelines? And not only when you expect to complete the project. You need to keep in mind country regulations and how long it will take to access a data source and run through the ethics review. In some countries, it takes a little longer. So if you lay out all of your expected timelines from the beginning to the end, the supplier can also respond with a more feasible timeline and align on your expectations. On the right of the visual, I have also included a few things to consider that are not specifically on the request, but should also be considered when sending requests to suppliers. Communicate. Allow the supplier to ask questions, but also allow time for suppliers to gather questions, resources, identify data sources. A lot of different things goes into creating an RFP, and it does take time to put together a proposal. So keeping that communication open will help the suppliers design the best proposal for your project. Format the request in a manner that is easily digestible and a sort of flow that explains the value story of your project. Also, what type of request is this RFP? Is this a market access request? Is this an epidemiology request? This changes the RFP. The type of information to provide in the RFP will be different, and this also ties back to the end user to keep in mind who is the information going to be generated for. Also, take ownership. It's your project and you still own the results. This is a partnership, and definitely being actively involved in engaging will ensure the project is successful until completion. Most importantly, what do you want? Be upfront with suppliers and what you're looking for and what are deal breakers, such as if the supplier must have access to the data source of interest. Each supplier will have their own strength and expertise, but up to you decide on what you're looking for. If budget is a priority, then state that as well. Suppliers can focus on what matters to you when they write a proposal, and they can also determine if they are the right fit for the project as well. Next slide, please. So the last slide is meant to summarize the key messages from our presentation today. Because of time, and I want to allow time for Q&A, I'm going to skip down to the last point that this is, we do this all for the patient. At the end of the day, this is all for the patient and to improve health outcomes. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that, Julie. Also, thank you to Patty and Mary Beth for their portions of the presentation. At this point, I would like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions or comments right now using that questions window. This, of course, is the Q&A portion of the webinar now. And we've already received some questions here, so let's get started. Our first question: how is real-world data collected, organized, applied, and processed? So I'll leave that open to the panel.
I can go ahead and take that. This is Julie Carter. So real-world evidence, the data is collected in a variety of different ways. There's a lot of different types of data sources. So you have electronic medical records, claims database, types of data sources that are already available. You can also collect it through prospective studies, through observational research, and through clinical trials. You also have registries, patient-powered networks, and sometimes you can also use social media for real-world evidence. You can also link all these data sources together. Not all, but some of the data sources can be linked together, and some of the best databases will have more than one data source combined. So when you do this, you want to make sure, check for quality, standardize the data, and also check for completeness and generalizability of the data to the general population. And when it comes to processing, just keep in mind the different regulatory requirements in different countries that to access the data, it may take a little bit longer in different countries due to regulations.
Interesting. Okay, thank you very much for that. Moving on to another question here. What are some emerging topics and trends in HEOR original research?
This is Patty. I'll take this question. I think over the 20+ years that I've been working in the HEOR and RWE arena, the thing that I see the most change is the improvement in how our industry is looking at the business case that actually drives the research. I think there's a much better understanding that there is a business application, and the business application absolutely includes that final point that Julie made, which is the improvement of the patient outcomes. But it is letting that business case help us understand what the research methodology is. And the business case is different than the research question, although they obviously should be related. I think another trend that I see is the big data, or more importantly, probably big insights that we are getting from big data and the application of artificial intelligence and natural language processing to that. And then I believe that we're making some enormous strides in innovative new trial designs, such as pragmatic clinical trials and hybrid designs that speed up and address some of the methodologic concerns with the types of real-world evidence approaches that we've used previously. And then fourthly, I think a big area of improvement, but it is probably the vista that is the largest for HEOR, is the value communication strategy. I think we are getting better at understanding whether or not the data that we are collecting are reaching the business case that we are striving for. But we need to do better as an organization, as an industry, to build in a feedback loop on the end customer use of those value communications. We're actually have a benchmarking study in the field with respect to that, and learning some pretty interesting things. So I think those would be my 4 areas of HEOR expansion.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Patty. Very interesting. Let's move on to another question here. Will a few large phase 2 and 3 clinical trial CROs capture 80% plus of the RWE, HEOR, and epidemiology market by expanding their clinical research preferred provider MSA to cover these new service areas? Any thoughts on that from the panel?
So this is Mary Beth. I heard the question as, are we going to have 2 or 3 groups take over all of this? Are those groups going to be people that are already doing clinical trials? Are they going to be the ones that are doing real-world evidence studies as well? Is that the question?
I believe so. That sounds right to me.
I sure hope not. Maybe I'll say it that way. In my experience, there is always nuance to a real-world evidence study. The reason the study is being done matters quite a bit, as Patty was just saying. The business case and articulating the business case are truly important. And because of that, I think that the people who have expertise in observational studies, in operations research, and outcomes research, in epidemiology, they are the ones who are very well suited to be able to work within this space and within real world evidence, much more so than trialists would be.
Interesting. Thank you for that, Mary Beth. Moving to another question. We've got lots of questions coming in. Can you please describe the trend, if any, of using real-world evidence from one country to strengthen evidence to another country?
Ooh, I really like this question. Can I take another one?
Go ahead, yeah.
So we are seeing in regulatory submissions, even from Europe to the US or from the US to Europe, an increase in sharing the information that has been gathered from the place where the drug was first approved, to be able to utilize the post-marketing information in that jurisdiction within the application in the new jurisdiction. And we're finding that the US FDA and the EMA in Europe are both very interested in having that data, because it helps them to learn more about what the actual experience has been. And so I would say absolutely there is a trend towards seeing more of that in the regulatory space.
Interesting. Okay, thank you for that.
I'd like to, this is Patty, if I could add on to that. I think that also there is, with the sharing of the data from one region to another, or from one country to another, I think it's also given rise to a better understanding of the cultural differences in the application of data collection and how we derive insights out of that. And I think that that is also a particular area of potential growth from a health outcomes perspective that's really exciting. And I think some of the artificial intelligence processes are helping to elucidate some of those. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Mary Beth.
I would agree. I think that we are seeing the cultural differences in that, in the way that we're utilizing healthcare in general. And it also helps. It helps us to understand where there may be a difference in the healthcare versus a difference in what we're seeing with the drug. And so being able to isolate a particular drug and look for changes there or within a subgroup, it really helps us to understand what's going on within the healthcare arena from country to country in order to do that more quickly as well.
Mm-hmm. And with clinical trials, that was not quite as easy, but with the real-world evidence applications, then we can see some of those differences a little more clearly.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Interesting. Thank you both for that. Another question here. What does the future look like for real-world evidence in comparison with interventional studies?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think, speaking from the United States approach, I think we're seeing some really exciting things going on, of course, with Scott Gottlieb's approach to the real-world evidence framework, and just the application of RWE in terms of regulatory approval, and the exciting focus on whether or not the real-world data are a fit for the kind of question being asked, whether or not the trial or the design is appropriate. And I'm particularly excited about the acceptance of that and the development of that framework. I think also that there are some really exciting new randomized trial designs that we're getting much more insight in and gaining some experience with.
Right. Okay. Well, thank
Oh.
you for that.
This
Go on.
is,
Sorry.
sorry, this is Julie. I would like to add to that also that what I see a trend that's happening with regulatory is that they're opening up and accepting more real-world evidence, the data from real-world evidence. And also this is just to help with the long clinical trial designs, the timelines that it takes such a long time to get a drug out into the market. So opening up and allowing real-world evidence reduces those timelines and allow patients to get products more quickly. So regulatory is opening up basically to benefit the patient and allowing and accepting more real-world evidence.
So true. One of the, I'm sorry, Mary Beth, you go ahead.
I was just going to add that I completely agree with what's been said. I think that these are also not mutually exclusive. I think that there are definitely interventional studies like pragmatic trials that would also be real-world evidence. And so I think we're likely to see an increase in that moving forward. And with the EMA and having this low-risk interventional study as well, I think that we're likely to see more of those moving forward too, where there's a slight change in clinical practice in order to gain the information, but it's not such a change that it's true interventional study.
Definitely agree with you, Mary Beth. They're not exclusive of each other, and just taking the benefits from a clinical trial and complementing them with the benefits of real-world evidence helps with addressing some of the challenges within both of them. So having a study being creative and combining some of the practices from a clinical trial and real-world evidence study helps with resolving some of the disadvantages of both of them.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
I think one of the interesting things that is happening on the manufacturer side is how organizationally they are setting themselves so that the individuals that are involved in RWE work are also collaborating appropriately with the regulatory division as well. And with these potential FDA changes, I think that's going to be incredibly important so that there is more nimbleness on the side of the manufacturer to take as much opportunity with these changes as possible.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you all for that. Lots of opinions there on that one. Thank you. Another question, do you think that real-world data could be used for drug approvals by regulatory authorities in the near future? And this audience member goes on to say, currently I believe real-world data is used to support coverage decisions and develop guidelines, etc. Could you give us some clarification on that?
This is Mary Beth. I'll start, and I'm sure others will join in. As we know, real-world evidence is utilized on the post-market side by regulators all the time for both safety and effectiveness studies, for long-term looks, or for just gathering more data on a particular product. We're also starting to see, especially in the labeling expansion realm, that the FDA and others are entertaining the potential for, when there is already off-label use, to be engaging in the real-world evidence space to learn more about what's going on there. And I think that we're also seeing an increased interest in understanding more of the patient perspective during initial approvals, as well as labeling expansions, and on really gaining a knowledge of the natural history of the disease, what the current clinical practice is, understanding how the disease is currently treated and what the paradigm change is expected to be with a new therapeutic. And all of those are certainly utilizing the real-world evidence that exists or can be generated during the pre-market time. And then I think as we move forward, benefit risk assessments are also going to be using the data that already exists as part of that pre-market look into just how this particular new product, the benefits there, the risks there, compare with what's going on in that particular therapeutic area already.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mary Beth, on this. And if there's already enough evidence, especially for label expansion, if you already have enough evidence proving a strong case for health outcomes, then there really is no need to go through a long clinical trial process and a costly clinical trial process. So I do think we will be seeing more data from real-world evidence being used for regulatory approval.
I have a question for my panelists, and maybe some of the attendees might have some thoughts too with respect to this. You know, certainly FDA spoke favorably about the observational study designs to support the effectiveness determinations, but there's also been a concern expressed by FDA about the potential lack of transparency, especially in the retrospective observational studies, which don't have to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. And the possibility that those retrospective analyses could be conducted multiple times and relatively inexpensively in the construct of the total drug development costs until the desired outcome was found. Do either of you have any thoughts about the retrospective observational studies and the use for labeling?
Well, I think that there's definitely a lot going on, and I would go back to what is the research question of interest and how can the data that already exists help to address that research question. I think in some regards, well, in many regards, the data that already exist are not necessarily compliant to the requirements that the FDA has for data collection, and so there's some concern there, understandably, on their part. I think also that, you know, having a put together full, complete protocol is something that they are used to in the pre-market space, and seeing all of that well in advance of the study being conducted and being able to weigh in on that. My guess is that they would still want to be able to weigh in on protocols well in advance of studies being conducted. And I think that both ISPOR and ISPE in their guidelines have said that it is also important to develop these protocols on previously collected data and within data sources that already exist, so that it's important to develop the protocol within one data source and then do the pivotal analysis within another data source whenever possible. And so I think that utilizing the guidelines that are out there from these international societies is really important in this regard. And I think that FDA has said that when companies want to do this, that they want to talk with them early and often. And so I think that's probably the recommendation for now.
Right. Okay, well, thank you all for that. Another question here: when building preferred or approved supplier lists, what broad subcategories would the panel recommend? For example, is supplier base and expertise different or similar across HEOR versus real-world evidence? Your thoughts there?
This is Julie Carter. I think it really does depend on what you're looking for. It depends on, like, what, as Mary Beth keeps alluding to, what is the research question and what type of study are you looking to complete. I think when you look back and just plan on what kind of services you're looking for, then you can align with what suppliers you're looking for, because definitely each supplier has their own strength and expertise. So you want to not just pick a supplier based on what you see or what they're providing. You want to think first on what you're looking for and what you need. So start with that, and then you can start picking on suppliers that best suit the needs and gaps that you're trying to fulfill.
I concur with you. Then I think also one of the challenges, as Mary Beth alluded to, oftentimes we tend to look to data source before really fleshing out the methodology or the feasibility, and that's absolutely true. It's also quite understandable because the detail that we need on evaluating data sources is not easily accessible in a singular database, for example. And so I think oftentimes suppliers will have the ability to do a project methodologically, but the data source is not what they thought it was going to be when they bid on the project, and so it becomes a challenge midway through. I don't know if you have that kind of experience, Mary Beth.
I do indeed, and I would agree wholeheartedly. Yes, I would add that you really do need to think through the technical aspects, the operational aspects, and the experience and expertise of the group. I would also add that sometimes we're working with smaller companies, and if you're not quite sure what you want or you don't have the expertise in-house, I would add that it's also nice to have a partner that you're working with who do have a broad experience across lots of different areas, because that way you may want one thing but then realize later on that you needed something else. And if you're working with a group that has lots of different perspectives, then you'll be able to know that earlier on.
All right, fantastic. Thank you all for that. Let's squeeze in another question before the top of the hour here. If real-world data will increasingly be used for regulatory submissions, is there an expectation that regulatory inspections of the sponsor will expand to cover real-world evidence studies? And if so, what regulatory framework will they assess these studies against?
This is the quick question before the top of the hour? Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
So from my own personal experience, I think that FDA is definitely going to be looking to the regulation that particular study falls under. So if it is a pre-market clinical study, whether that falls to an interventional clinical trial space or it falls to a real-world evidence space, then that study is going to fall to those regulations. If it's a post-market study, it'll fall to the post-market regulations. And I think that they will be looking at the evidence accordingly. I think this is probably part of why the FDA is being so deliberate in their consideration of real-world evidence and how this is going to play out for them, because there may need to be regulatory changes in order for real-world evidence to be accepted broadly across their span, or it may be that the way that we're collecting data within healthcare may need to change a bit. And so I think that there are standards that are under developed, FHIR and the like, that may be more helpful for us to get to where we need to be in order for real-world evidence to be more aligned to the approval process regulations in the U.S. But there's lots of nuances here, and so I don't know that we can really fully address this particular question. It's really going to be very nuanced to the study itself.
I would also think that the oncology market might give us some insight into what may be a future template, because there is, the FDA currently has NDAs under review where RWD and RWE are helping to inform whether or not that product is acceptable, and so in the oncology arena. And so we may get a nod from the FDA of how they might go about that in other therapeutic areas based on the oncology approach.
I also would like to add, this is Julie, that there was the new law that was signed in 2016, the FDA Cures Act. So we are going to see more guidelines from regulatory coming up, that they are in discussions for more the guidelines and the framework of how to use RWE. So there are going to be more developments coming for this.
All right, interesting. Well, thank you very much for that. Lots to consider there. We have reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. If we weren't able to attend to your questions today, the team at scientist.com may try to follow up with you after the webinar. And if you do have any further questions, you can direct those to the email addresses showing on your screen for all of our speakers right now. So Julie at scientist.com, Patty at healtheconomics.com, and Mary Beth at mritchie at rti.org. And thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And a survey window will be popping up on your screen shortly. Your participation is appreciated as it'll help us improve our further webinars. Now, I just sent you 2 links in your chat box, the first of which will take you to the registration page and the spot where you can review the recording of this event. You can share that with your colleagues using any of the share buttons there, or you can use the second link to quick share on LinkedIn. So I encourage you to do that as well if you found this useful, and I'm sure you did. Thank you everyone for today's conference. Special thanks, of course, to our speakers today, Mary Beth Ritchie, Patty Peoples, and Julie Carter. We hope that you found this webinar informative today. Have a great day, everyone.